Today's parashah is a very important one. So 10 words. But it's only three short chapters, but it's packed full of information. Each of those 3 chapters have a totally different character. Starting in chapter 18, it's devoted to the exchange between Moshe and his father-in-law Yitro. Chapter 19 looks at their arrival at Mount Horev and the preparations that were taking place for that 3rd day. And finally, and the most important one, chapter 20, the actual giving of the 10 foundational words of the Torah. So let's look firstly at chapter 18. Who was Yitro? We're not told much about him. In fact, all we know is that he was the father of Moshe, the father-in-law of Moshe, the father of Zipporah. His name was also known as Reuel, which means friend of God. He was a Midianite priest, and he was also a direct descendant of Abraham through the concubine Keturah. Now he knew Yahweh as El Shaddai, and he said to Moshe in chapter 18, verse 10 and 11, "Blessed be Yahweh, who has rescued you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh. And now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the other gods." Now he only knew Yahweh by name because Moshe had told him who he was. Up till that point he'd only known God as El Shaddai. But after seeing what had happened, them being taken out of Egypt, and also coming through the Red Sea, and being brought to the very foot of Mount Horev, where Moshe had first of all spoken with Yahweh at the burning bush, he now realizes that this God is the God of all gods. He is something set apart. So we're also told that he made a burnt offering to Yahweh, and he sat down with Moshe and Aaron and all the leaders of Israel. They shared a meal together, and that was the meal of the sacrifice. And this became a practice that was continued in Israel throughout the time that they were in the land. Now, when a person brought a thanksgiving offering to Yahweh, they sat down with the Cohen who actually offered that sacrifice on their behalf. This was the fellowship that took place in the Mishkan and in the temple. Joining together with Moshe, Aaron, and the tribal leaders for that meal was also an ancient Near Eastern practice. It was a meal that actually sealed a bond between separate independent people groups. So here we have a priest of the Midianites joining forces with this new body of Israelites, albeit that they both be related through Abraham. They were, to all intents and purposes, virtual enemies. So this is an opportunity for them to bind together in fellowship. So Yitro gives Moshe admonition. In the latter part of chapter 18, we have a chronological enigma. Because after the day of eating together, Yitro sets out to instruct Moshe about what he should and should not do in talking to the people of Israel on matters of law and teaching. There's a problem here because this is before Yahweh had given the Torah. So what was he teaching the people? It may well be that this portion has been taken and put in that place because it's a chapter about Yitro, but in actual fact it probably relates to the time they were leaving Horev. By that stage they had the Torah. Remember, the golden calf incident had happened, and they were in a state of confusion. How can we gain favor with Yahweh? So if we look at that scenario in terms of Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, we see when Moshe is looking back, when he's speaking to that second generation, he says, Yahweh spoke to us at Mount Horev. He said, you have lived long enough at this mountain. Turn and get moving. Go to the hill country of the Amori, and to the places near there in the Arava, and to the land of the Canaani. At that time I told you, you are too heavy a burden for me to carry alone. Now that's Moshe speaking to that second generation. He realized they were a burden. All their way through that 40 years, they had been troublesome. So this is what Yitro was warning him against. And he said he needed others to support him. But it was really for Yahweh to tell him that, not Yitro. Because Yahweh had instructed him on how to deal with the people. That's a bit of an enigma. Anyhow, the reality is that after the golden calf incident, they were a constant problem. The stage where the burden was constantly on Moshe's shoulders. That's why he did choose 70 people to be the leaders. Anyhow, whether it was before or after the giving of Torah, we see Moshe and Yitro parted amicably, and Yitro went back to his own land with his daughter and the two sons of Moshe. So moving on to chapter 19, we see that Israel moved from Rephidim to Horev. In this chapter, we see that Israel have arrived at Mount Horev approximately 45 days after departing from Egypt. The mountain is known, of course, by two names, Mount Sinai or Mount Horev. I prefer to use the name Mount Horev rather than Sinai because the traditional location of Mount Sinai is in the lower part of the Sinai Peninsula, where in actual fact, when he went to the burning bush, he was tending the sheep of Yitro in the land of Midian. And where is Midian? Across the Gulf of Aqaba, in what we know as Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't on the Sinai Peninsula. That was Queen Helena who decided that was the location. So I think it's important to talk about it as Mount Horev, because that is clearly Hebraic, where Sinai is more Greek in its origin. But the actual name of the mountain today is Jabal al-Lawz, which is an Arabian title for it. And we see that they arrived there in time for the mountain, or for Yahweh to come down upon the mountain on the day of Shavuot. Now Shavuot is only 50 days after Bikurim. So we see, both in Jewish tradition and in chapter 2, which we read this morning from the book of Acts, that Yahweh's presence came to that mountain and again to the temple in Acts 2 on the day of Shavuot. And as Leviticus chapter 23 quite clearly tells us, that Shavuot falls 50 days after Bikurim. So when does Bikurim occur? It's in the middle of the week of Matzah, around about normally the 4th day. So what is so significant about that? We know that it's the day that Yeshua ascended to heaven, the day after his resurrection. But when we go back to the time of Moshe, after they'd left on the 15th day of Aviv, they wandered around in the wilderness and turned back to the head of the Gulf of Suez. It was probably the 4th day that they actually crossed the Red Sea. That would have been the day of Bikurim. And that's when the count starts from there to the time of giving the 10 words at Mount Horev. So looking now at the 3 days of preparation. Having arrived at Mount Horev, they set up camp, and Moshe was called up the mountain by Yahweh. There he received the instructions on how the people were to prepare themselves. He was given clear instructions of what was expected of Israel. Having made a covenant with Israel before they departed from Egypt, Yahweh was now preparing to give the second part of that covenant. In Exodus chapter 19, 4 through 6, Israel was being prepared for the marriage relationship with Yahweh. The events that took place at Mount Horev during those days was, in the giving of the 10 words, what became the model of the ancient Hebrew wedding. Now, the same pattern is still practiced in Jewish communities even today, and the modern wedding in the Messianic community has been adopted from the same principles, as Catherine can vouch for. Thank you. What about the pending marriage? Just like the modern marriage celebrant, Moshe had to act as a mediator between Yahweh and Israel in the exchange of their vows. In the 2 days leading up to the exchange, Yahweh instructed Moshe what the people would encounter. So they were to prepare themselves. They were to wash their clothes. And they were not to have sexual relations for 2 days during that time of preparation. They were to be ritually clean. The boundaries were also set around the mountain, beyond which no human being or animal could venture. This is a reflection of how the modern Jewish and Messianic bride prepares herself from the time of betrothal. While the groom is away preparing the bridal chamber, the bride is adorning herself and remaining chaste. It is also a reflection of Yeshua and his bride, who, after 2 days, or 2,000 years, during which the Messianic community has been waiting, they have had to be spiritually chaste, such as is talked about in Revelation chapter 14, verse 4. So on the 3rd day, when Yahweh came down on the Mount Horev, nobody, apart from Moshe and Aaron, as the mediators between Yahweh and the people, were allowed near that mountain. In chapter 19:9, Yahweh said to Moshe, I am going to come to you in thick cloud, so that the people will be able to hear when I speak, and with you, and also to trust you forever. That is, to trust Moshe, because he was the giver of the Torah. He has always been trusted by Israel. So the actual wedding. What is the Hebraic wedding all about? There are 3 stages in the Hebraic wedding. The betrothal, in which the groom seeks out the bride and enters into the marriage relationship in the form of the engagement. The relation in Israel was the first. That portion of the covenant was the first portion that was given while they were still in Egypt. On the night of Pesach, they were betrothed to Yahweh. The marriage itself took place under the covering of the Huppah, which is the great cloud that came down over the mountain. Yahweh came into the cloud, and he presented himself to the people right there on Mount Horev. The third thing that is needed to make the marriage complete is the ketubah. This is the marriage document or covenant which spells out the terms of that marriage. Israel received their ketubah from Yahweh in the form of the 10 words. Now these 3 features of the Hebrew wedding are also the foundation of the relationship between Yahweh and his people Israel. So now let's look at the significance of the ketubah in chapter 20. The 10 words. When Yahweh spoke forth the 10 words, when Yahweh spoke forth the 10 words to Moshe, all the people heard was the sound of the shofar and a sound like thunder. As stated in chapter 20, verse 15, all the people experienced thunder and lightning, the sound of the shofar, and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled. And Yahweh was speaking forth the words of his marriage ketubah. In the same way, the bride and the groom exchange vows, and then the details of the ketubah are read as part of the marriage ceremony. But at Mount Horev, the reading of the ketubah by Yahweh was beyond what the people could bear. The result was a rapid withdrawal of the people. As Moshe said in verse 16, "You speak with us and we will listen. But don't let God speak to us, or we will die. Those words were an exact opposite from what they had said to Moshe during those 2 days of preparation in verse 8, where they said, everything Yahweh said, we will do. How quickly things can change. So we must remember, why were they so fearful? This was the first direct encounter they had had with God. Even though Yahweh had brought them through the wilderness, he had rescued them from the advancing Egyptians at the Red Sea, he'd given them water to drink and food to eat, but they had still never had experienced any encounter like the one at Mount Horev. Daunted by the prospect of being in a covenant relationship with Yahweh, even before Moshe had delivered the marriage ketubah, that is the 2 stones tablets, Israel had turned their backs on Yahweh. What did they do in that 40 days? They built the golden calf. So almost immediately they broke that marriage vow, and their relationship with Yahweh as his bride had come to an end. Making the golden calf was the first act of adultery on the part of Israel. Regrettably, their time at Mount Horev became one of sadness rather than joy. So, what about the ketubah itself, the 10 words? Now, looking at chapter 20, verses 1 through 14, we see the words of Yahweh that Yahweh spoke from the mountain were the same words that were written on those 2 stone tablets. It was the marriage ketubah. The 10 words later became more commonly known, of course, as the 10 commandments. But they've always been the bedrock of justice throughout all the civilized societies of the world. All developed nations have adopted the principles laid down in those 10 words, even though they were actually given exclusively to Israel. It was Yahweh's desire that Israel would be a nation of Kohanim, or priests, and would spread that message throughout the world. Regrettably, they failed before Moshe had even given them the tablets inscribed with those words. However, many generations later, Yahweh, in his wisdom, took individuals from among the people of Israel, and along with others from among the nations. And they were set apart to be Kohanim, who would complete the work that had been ordained for Israel. The personally selected individuals were first taken from the tribe of Yehudah during the Second Temple period, after the death and resurrection of Yeshua, and also from among the nations, to become a kingdom of Kohanim, who would join with Yeshua as the Kohen Gadol, the great high priest. By ratifying the new covenant through his death and resurrection, Yeshua formed a new body of Kohanim, and what Shaul called later on the one new man. They alone are the ones who, with Yahweh, will form the kingdom of priests during the 1,000-year reign of Yeshua. They are to be his bride in the place of Israel. The majority have been taken from among the descendants of those who stood at Mount Horev, but along with them, of course, selected Gentiles who will be the bride of Yeshua. Just as Israel was intended to be the bride of Yahweh at Mount Horev. While this may sound arrogant or exclusive, it remains a fact that Yahweh only selects whom he wants. No one can personally elect to become one or part of the one new man, that is, the bride of Yeshua, unless he or she is personally called by Yahweh. Now, which are the 10 words in those verses 1 to 14 of chapter 20? If we look at verse 1, it has been widely debated by both Jews and Gentiles throughout history where it says, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the abode of slavery. The dispute has always centered around whether or not this verse is actually considered as the first commandment, or is it to be read as a preface to the other 10 words that follow. Many modern scholars and theologians believe that it's a preface. However, there is one modern rabbi that I've heard recently who suggested that it is a request from Yahweh rather than a command. While it appears to be an emphatic statement, the rabbi suggests that it is a request that requires the hearer to make a choice. Now he's suggesting that God is stating who he is and what he has done for Israel by bringing them out of slavery in Egypt. By saying, I am Yahweh your God, is Yahweh really saying, I want you to accept me as your God? Accepting Yahweh as God, as our God, is something that can only be done by a free will choice from us. Yahweh does not force any human being to accept him as their God, whether Jew or Gentile. Rather, he wants a relationship built on a desire expressed by the hearer. If this understanding is valid, it is a request to carry out an obligation. It carries an obligation. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 14, we are told, this will be a day that you'll remember and celebrate as a festival to Yahweh for generation to generation. You are to celebrate it as a perpetual regulation. If the people of Israel had made a free will choice to acknowledge Yahweh as their God, then the observance of Pesach would be a constant reminder, a memorial reminder. At the same time each year, throughout every generation, when they were in Eretz Isra'El and in exile. It has been perhaps the most unifying observance of all Israel, and one feature of Jewish life that has held them together as a people throughout history. It seems reasonable that the rabbi may well be right in his assessment of the meaning of Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. It is also something that as Talmidim of Yeshua, we have been invited to observe annually, that reminder. Firstly, of what Yeshua did through his death and resurrection at the time of Pesach, and also to observe the annual reminder that we are part of the national life of Israel. Now, we're not adopted into any of the 12 tribes, but as Shaul says, we are part of the one new man. Therefore, we have a direct relationship with both Yeshua and Yahweh, who are one and the same. So we celebrate both his ratification of the new covenant in his death and resurrection, and we also celebrate Pesach, which is the reminder of the original relationship between Yahweh and his people Israel at Mount Horev. So what about the fourth word? Observance of Shabbat. In chapter 20, verses 8 to 10, he spells out clearly what Yahweh requires of Israel in relationship to Shabbat. When he says, remember the day, Shabbat, to set it apart for God. You have 6 days to labor and do your work, but on the 7th day, the Shabbat for Yahweh is for Yahweh your God. Perhaps the most odious alteration to the 10 words was the change of that fourth word, the day of the keeping of Shabbat. Without any scriptural mandate, the churches of Christendom adopted Sunday, which in Scripture is always referred to as the first day of the week. the change was a blatant step towards replacement theology. As we read in last week's parashah, the Shabbat was given to Israel on their journey between Egypt and Mount Horev. In Exodus chapter 16, verses 22-23, we're told, on 6 days they gathered twice as much, on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers per person, and all the community of leaders came and reported to Moshe. He told them, "This is what Yahweh has said. Tomorrow is a holy Shabbat for Yahweh." The Shabbat, which was given along with the man, the bread from heaven, was all part of the confirmation of that fourth word or commandment in the ketubah. The Shabbat came to be known in the Hebrew community as the wedding ring of Yahweh, or which Yahweh gave to his bride. So why would anyone who acknowledges Yeshua as the Messiah of Israel and the bridegroom want to replace that wedding ring with the ring of another? Something we need to think about. The chapter concludes in verses 19 and 20 with the strong words from Yahweh to Moshe that Israel are not to make any images of any likeness of anything in the world. Further, they are told if they build an altar, it's to be of uncut stone, and for the express purpose of offering sacrifices to Yahweh alone. Why is it to be uncut stones? Because all the nations built altars to their gods, and they made them out of polished stones. God didn't want that. He wanted things natural. He wanted a relationship that was important, not a showy display of men's capability. Finally, Yahweh rejected Israel. As we read in Isaiah chapter 6, in the year of the death of Yeshayahu, Yahweh finally turned his back on his people, his rebellious people Israel. In chapter 6, verse 11, Isaiah asks Yahweh, how long are you going to put up with the rebellion of Israel? The answer is given in verses 12 and 13, which concludes by showing that even through the greater part of Israel had been cast out, there still remained a remnant. Like the oak tree, that is the trunk that's cut down, it remains alive even when all the leaves have fallen off. Again, in Haggai chapter 2, when speaking about the third temple, which is to be built during the time of the reign of Yeshua, we see that all the nations of the world will flow up to that temple. However, before that can occur, in chapter 2, verse 6 and 7, Yahweh says, "It won't be long before one more time I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all the nations, so that the treasures of the nations will flow in, and I will fill my house with glory," says Yahweh Zevaot. And again in verse 22, "I will overturn the thrones of kingdoms. I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations, and I will overturn the chariots of the people riding on them. The horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his own brother." So in conclusion, Shaul sums up the whole situation when speaking about the one new man in Hebrews chapter 12. We have been promised a place, not at Mount Horev, but in the place of Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the New Jerusalem, as part of the community of the firstborn, because Yeshua is the mediator of a new covenant. Therefore, as part of the bride betrothed to Yeshua, we also will be alongside the bridegroom, part of that new covenant. Then in chapter 12, verse 26, Shaul reflects on the words of Haggai itself, saying, "One more time I will shake, and not only the earth, but heaven too." So just as Yahweh shook the earth twice, or shook Israel twice, for their disobedience and rejection of his Torah, so he will also shake the churches of Christendom, along with all the other nations, at the time of his return. But our promise is that we will have a place in that unshakable kingdom, that is, the kingdom of God. So like Israel, who stood at Mount Horev to become the bride of Yahweh, we're offered the opportunity to become part of the bride of Yeshua. And we'll always remain with him, right through eternity, in the heavenly Mount Zion. Shabbat Shalom. For those who didn't get my email on Thursday evening, and for those who are watching the video later, these readings are set apart rather than the parashah, the normal parashah for today. I thought it was appropriate to continue the story that we started last week, looking at the giving of the 10 words on Mount Horev. These chapters, particularly chapter 24 and the whole of chapter 31, 32 and 33, and then on to chapter 34, give us a chronological continuation of the story. The chapters that intervene in between give us the mitzvot and the rulings that Yahweh was giving to Moshe. And they are important also. But it's important to see the chronological sequence of events that occurred while they were at the foot of Mount Horev. It's all about relationships. There were 3 parties involved: Yahweh himself, Moshe, and the people of Israel. And the relationship between them all is so vitally important, because even today in the 21st century, it's so similar. The things that we encounter, the ways we feel towards Yahweh, are so deeply reflected in these words, which we are considering today. So bear with me as we go through these. It is quite complex, so tighten your seatbelts, because we're going to dive deep into the narrative of this period. Okay, having received the 10 words in chapter 20, we're now moving on to look at to recap the chronological sequence of events that occurred immediately after that. As we saw last week in chapter 20, verses 15 through 18, and during the giving of the 10 words, the people were actually at the base of the mountain, and all they experienced during that time was thunder, lightning, and the sound of the shofar. They did not hear the actual words that Yahweh was giving to Moshe when he was up there in the cloud. They were overwhelmed by this whole experience and said to Moshe, "You speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us or we will die." That's how they felt. So those were the words of the people to Moshe, and set the tone of the relationship between Yahweh and his people. They wanted a mediator between them and God himself. But remember, the 10 words were given to them as a marriage covenant between Yahweh himself and his people Israel. However, his presence there at the top of the mountain was so overpowering for them. They didn't want to be directly in his midst or in his presence. They wanted a mediator in between. At that stage, Moshe had only spoken the words to Yahweh that Yahweh had given, verbally. He had not had them written down by Yahweh himself. So in response, in verses 4 through 8 of chapter 24, Moshe is told to build an altar at the base of the mountain and set up 12 stones. Then he proceeded to make burnt offerings and a peace offering on that altar. He also took some of the blood of the sacrificial animals and splashed it against the altar. Then he took what he'd written down in the book of what Yahweh had given him and read it aloud to the people. He told the people everything that Yahweh had said. Satisfied to hear the words of Moshe, they responded by saying, everything Yahweh said, everything Yahweh spoke, we will do and we will obey. This was basically their vow at the marriage covenant. That was an interesting response. Moshe then took some of that blood from the sacrificial animals and sprinkled all the people to confirm the covenant. Because remember, blood must be spilt for a covenant to be fulfilled. So, as they could not spill their own blood, they had to use a substitute sacrificial animal. Now remember, it's a marriage covenant between Yahweh and his people, and it was now complete. Complete in the sense that everything had been done that should be done, in accordance with the ancient Hebrew wedding. Now remember, when they left Egypt, they were betrothed to Yahweh, and they did everything he promised, albeit arguing with him all the way through the wilderness on the way to Mount Horev. Then he comes down on the mountain and confirms the covenant. That was the giving of the vow from Yahweh. And what was their response? Everything you say, we will do. The marriage covenant was bound. But for a covenant to take effect, there must be the spilling of blood. And a marriage covenant in ancient Israel, and even modern Israel, the bride must be a virgin, because the consummation of the marriage breaks the virginity and blood is spilled. That's why he built an altar at the base of the mountain, and the animals were used as a sacrificial blood spilling, and it was sprinkled over the people themselves, so the marriage was consummated. They were God's people for eternity. Next, of course, Yahweh wants to give Moshe the ketubah in written form. So, in chapter 24, verses 1 through 3, we read how he was again invited to go up the mountain. He alone was to go into the presence of Yahweh. And he said, Yahweh warned Aaron, Nadav, Abihu, and the 70 elders were to prostrate themselves at a distance. They weren't to go up the mountain. At a distance appears to mean a select group was actually gathered at the base of the mountain, while the rest of the people were out there well beyond the base of the mountain. After all, remember, the mountain was a sacred place. You only go onto the mountain by invitation of Yahweh himself. Now if we jump back to when Moshe was tending the sheep of Yitro, he saw the burning bush and he started to approach. And Yahweh said, take off your sandals because you are on holy ground. Where was he? At Mount Horev. It was that same place. It was a set apart place for Yahweh. So Moshe is going to be present with the God of Israel. Now that select group of Aaron and his 4 sons and the 70 elders were called together to the base of the mountain And while they were eating a meal together, which is the final culmination of the marriage, after it's been consummated, what happens? The banquet. Now here we are with Moshe and his brother and the 70 elders representing the rest of the people are having a meal in the presence of Yahweh himself. The marriage is now complete. And Yahweh himself appears before them. Under his feet was something like sapphire and stone pavement, clear as the sky itself. He did not reach out his hand against those noble ones of Israel. On the contrary, they saw God and they lived, even while they were eating and drinking. So there was the confirmation, the banquet, and everything was complete. There was only one thing missing, was the actual physical ketubah. So, Yahweh once again enters the presence of Yahweh. Moshe enters the presence of Yahweh. Just as in the way Yahweh entered into the presence with Yahweh, Yeshua also selected out people for himself. From among the crowd of Israel, he chose just 12 men to be his Talmudim. All the rest remained close by, but apart from them. As Matthew chapter 13, verse 10 says, "Then the Talmudim came and asked Yeshua, 'Why are we speaking in parables?' He answered, 'Because it has been given to you to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but it has not been given to them.'" That set the 12 apart from the rest of Israel. Now we are seeing at Mount Horev the noble ones, the 70 elders, and the family of Moshe and Aaron, were the ones who were privileged to be in that close community with Yahweh, just as Yeshua had the 12 in close proximity with him. So moving on from there, as I said before, the ketubah still had to be written. So Yahweh says, "Come up to me." Yahweh called Moshe, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the Torah and the mitzvot that I have written on them, so that you can teach them." Even though Moshe had written down everything that Yahweh had said while he was on the mountain, when the 10 words were given, Yahweh now wanted to give Moshe a permanent record so that they could be used to instruct the people in many generations to follow. So after the meal, Moshe alone, along with Yehoshua, ascends the mountain. But before departing, he gives instructions as to what is to happen in his absence. In verse 14, he said to the leaders, "Stay here for us until we come back." That's Yehoshua and Moshe. "See, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a problem should turn to them." So having parted company, Moshe and Yosef spent the next 6 days on the base of the mountain, just below the cloud, awaiting further instructions. It's not until the Shabbat, the 7th day, that Yahweh called Moshe out of the cloud and invited him up into his presence at the top of the mountain. Yehoshua appears to have stayed further down the mountain below the cloud line. Only Moshe went up into the presence of Yahweh. Now while all this was happening, the people of Israel saw the glory of Yahweh as a raging fire on the top of the mountain. After Moshe had entered the cloud, we are told that he spent 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain. Terrible trouble develops in Moshe's absence. Now on the 40th day, Yahweh finished speaking with Moshe and gave him the 2 tablets of testimony, which were, of course, the ketubah. They were inscribed with the finger of God. Meanwhile, the people had become very disheartened because what had become of Moshe? He descended into the cloud with fire on top of the mountain. They were convinced that he was gone for good. So moving on to chapter 32, verse 1, we see the outworking of all their despondency. They finally gather around Aaron and say, we need to do something. So Aaron says, get busy. And they say to him, get busy and make us gods to go ahead of us, because this Moshe, the man who brought us up from Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. Now Moshe left Aaron and Hur as the people's advisors. That meant that Aaron, as the brother of Moshe, and having been the spokesman for Pharaoh, Aaron was the primary one responsible for their welfare. Possibly even he had lost faith in Moshe's ability to survive that fiery environment. So as a leader, of course, he had to make a quick decision what to do next. Would he meet the demands of the people and build a god for them? Or would he take the risk of rebellion from the dissenters within the community? In verse 2, he capitulates by saying, have your wives and your sons and your daughters strip off their gold earrings and bring them to me. He doubtless had assistants, someone who could make something out of molten gold. They melted down and fashioned it into the shape of a calf. Then in verse 4, it says, they said to Israel, Israel, here is your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt. The plural nature of the statement suggests that Aaron obviously had assistants. But regardless of the responsibility itself fell on him as their leader. Upon seeing the calf, Aaron built an altar in front of it. So it suggests that the calf was a reasonable size. Then he makes an extraordinary statement. Tomorrow it is going to be a feast for Yahweh. To having built the altar in front of the calf, Aaron suggests, it suggests that it was not the altar that Moshe had built, but rather he's built a new one. Early next morning, they get up, they make their burnt offerings and peace offerings. Then they sat down to eat and drink, and got up, indulging in revelries. What are revelries? The Oxford Dictionary defines it as being lively, noisy festivities involving drinking of large quantities of alcohol. We're not given any details about the revelries. Hence, there's been much conjecture over the centuries by various commentators of what it entailed, but it's not important. The type of offering that they were making on that altar in front of the golden calf would have been similar to the practices of all the cultures around them, the Canaanites and various other peoples. Because remember, at that stage, the book of Leviticus had not been written. There was no specific procedure laid down by Yahweh as to how sacrifices were to be offered. So they would have reverted back to what they had done before. As they said, give us gods to take us forward, that brought us out of Egypt. They were totally off track from a relationship with Yahweh. Finally, of course, after 40 days, Moshe returns. And again, he finds Yehoshua, and together they come towards the people. But Yahweh says in verse 7, your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have become corrupt. And Yahweh continues, I have been watching these people, and you can see how stiff-necked they are. Now leave me alone, so that my anger can blaze against them, and I can put an end to them. I will make a great nation out of you, Moshe. Now while Yahweh wanted to destroy the whole of Israel, because of their actions, Moshe pleads with him. And he reminds the people, firstly, that he'd made a promise to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the sky. Now here you want to destroy them. But having said that, we know from later scriptures that the loss of one generation was not a problem to Yahweh. Because we have the example in the time of Yeshua when Lazarus was woken up from death, which shows that Yeshua is capable of waking all people from death. So to kill off one generation there in the wilderness was not going to confound the promise that he'd made to Abraham. But Moshe brought out another point, which he brought to Yahweh. If you destroy those people, you will bring your own name into disgrace among the nations. On that matter, Yahweh reneged and realized the significance and allowed his people to continue living. So certain circumstances, humans can challenge God, provided it's done in the right manner. Having spared Israel, Moshe then turns round and becomes angry himself. So he throws down the tablets and smashes them right there at the base of the mountain. Stirred up with fire, Moshe himself takes action against the people. Having persuaded Yahweh to spare his people, Moshe then stands at the entrance to the camp and says, "Who is with Yahweh? Come to me." On his own kinsmen came out, the tribe of Levi came forward to him. He speaks out on behalf of Yahweh in verse 27 of chapter 32. Here is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Each of you is to put his sword on his side and go up and down the camp from gate to gate to every man and kill his own kinsman, his own friend, his own neighbor. 3,000 died that very day. Did Yahweh tell Moshe to do that? The narrative doesn't say. However, the action that Moshe took on that occasion was very similar to what Eliyahu had done when he challenged the Baal-worshipping prophets of Israel. Having proven who the real God was on Mount Carmel, he then took it upon himself to kill all 450 of those Baal-worshipping prophets. Again, did Yahweh ask him to do that? Or did he take it upon himself to do it? Once again, Scripture does not say. But both Eliyahu and Moshe have a future. Eliyahu had to flee for his life and was confronted by Yahweh at Mount Horev, of all places, before being taken away in a whirlwind. But before he was taken, he had to pass the mantle on to Elisha. Coming back to Moshe, he took it upon himself, it appears, to kill 3,000 men because Yahweh had spared them. His anger, he took that situation into his hands. What happened in the end? He didn't go into the land either. He had to pass on the mantle to his assistant, Yehoshua. So he and Elijah both had strange departures from this world. But as we know from the end of Revelation, at the end of the 1,000 years, both of them will be God's witnesses against the adversary. So both have an important role to play. But both took actions that appear not to have been ordained by Yahweh himself. So returning to the 3,000 that were killed in the golden calf incident, it was no accident of history that on the day the Ruach came down in its tongues of fire in 30 CE, that 3,000 people or men from Yehuda were actually added to the small beginnings of the Messianic community. 3,000 taken away, 3,000 returned. Now that's a good lesson for us in the 21st century, because God does allow dissenters to be removed from the community. But that does not necessarily mean that they will be immediately replaced. Sometimes it can take time, but that's allowed to happen. So what about the future of the tribe of Levi? Moshe said, "You have consecrated yourselves today to Yahweh because every one of you has been against his own son, is against his own kinsman, in order to bring a blessing upon yourselves today." As a result, their action, they were later set apart as Leviim, or servants of Yahweh, and Aaron's family became the Kohanim, or the priests. They were set apart from the other 12 tribes. The 12 tribes were receiving the inheritance of the land. But the tribe of Levi, only Yahweh would be their inheritance. They were set apart for a special purpose. In the same way, all who had been called to the Messianic community from 30 CE onward became part of the body of Yeshua, the new covenant body, the one new man, as Shaul spoke about it. The body of Yeshua will serve him as Kohanim when? In the Olam Haba, the age to come. So like the Levites who stood at Mount Horev and brought order to the community, so the ones who are part of the body of Yeshua will also be set apart as priests in the age to come. Now, one interesting feature of the narrative is that Moshe challenged Aaron for having been complicit about making the golden calf, but he did not speak any words of judgment toward him. Instead, when challenged, Aaron said in response, "My Lord, shouldn't be angry. You should know what these people are like. They are determined to be evil." So Moshe was obviously accepting of what Aaron had said. Then we move on to where Moshe pleads with Yahweh. It's Moshe that said to Israel, "You have committed a terrible sin. Now I will go up to Yahweh. Maybe he will atone for your sin." When Moshe confronted Yahweh about the future of Israel, he showed just how strongly he felt about God's people when he said, "Please, these people have committed a terrible sin. They have made themselves a god of gold. Now, if you will forgive them of their sin, forgive their sins. But if you won't, then I beg, blot me out of your book, which you have written." Now Moshe was prepared to sacrifice his own future for the future of Israel. If they were to be destroyed, he wanted to be destroyed with them. Because he did not at that stage understand the full significance of the future actions of Yeshua. He did not appreciate what it meant to be blotted out. However, Yahweh responded in a manner that was something of a rebuke to Moshe himself by saying, "Those who have sinned against me are the ones who will be blotted out of my book." Was that directed at Moshe, or was it directed at the people? We will see. It's not for us to tell God to blot us out of the book. Only at the end of the 1,000 years at the end of the reign of Yeshua, will God alone decide who is to be given eternal life and who is to be blotted out. It's not for us to judge others. It's not for us to judge ourselves. The whole generation stood there at Mount Horev because the whole generation that stood there at Mount Horev became even more contemptuous towards Yahweh. And all those that were 20 years old and older died there in the wilderness. Will they be blotted out of the book of life? Only God knows the answer. It's not for us to judge. But there is for Israel a punishment yet to come. In chapter 32, it concludes with verses 33 to 35, with Yahweh saying to Moshe, "Those who have sinned against me are the ones who will be blotted out of my book. Now go and lead the people to the place that I told them about. My angel will go ahead of you. Nevertheless, the time for punishment will come, and then I will punish them for their sin." Yahweh struck the people with a plague because they had made the calf, the one Aaron had made. Yahweh was saying there will be consequences for their actions. The people would be struck with a plague because of their sins of the golden calf incident. But in these verses, it does not say exactly when this would occur. However, if we go back to Shemot chapter 30, verses 11 through 16, we see that at the time the census was taken of the people 20 years and older, they had to pay a ransom of half a shekel. The money was to be used in the service of the yet-to-be-built Mishkan. The money was a constant reminder that Yahweh had atoned for their lives. So we're reading about this future event in chapter 32, but the actual census is written about in chapter 30. So you can see why I've moved things around. I'm not taking away or adding to. It's just rearranging the order in which things are presented, which gives a better appreciation of the sequence of events that is occurring. Let's move on to Israel's remorse. Chapter 33 opens with the people showing remorse for their actions. But that was only because Yahweh had said he would not go with them on their travels to Canaan. Suddenly they realized they were on their own. In verse 5, Yahweh says, "Tell the people of Israel, you are stiff-necked people. If I go up with you, even for one moment, I will exterminate you." That's how strongly Yahweh felt. "Now keep your ornaments off. Then I will decide what to do with you." These are the very things that ended up becoming the golden calf, the ornaments. So from Mount Horev onward, the people of Israel stripped themselves of all their ornaments. Slowly, through chapter 33, everything begins to settle down. And Moshe begins to instruct the people and starts settling their differences in a manner that was indicated back in chapter 18. There, Yitro advised Moshe to seek the support of other people in dealing with the people. That is why I believe that that it was after the golden calf incident that Yitro was actually instructing Moshe about leadership support. Now let's look at the tent of meeting. Moshe pitched this tent after the people had been told that Yahweh would not be going with them. They became contritious. They were full of questions as to what was going to happen in the future. So Moshe pitches the tent, which was not the Mishkan, that had not yet been built. But he builds this tent of meeting outside the camp, and he has daily sessions with the people to settle their disputes, their questions, their anxieties. There he also consults Yahweh, who comes down in the column of cloud and settles at the entrance to the tent. Now it must be remembered that at that stage of the journey, Moshe had only just received the 10 words and he'd smashed them. So all he had to instruct the people with was what he had actually written down himself. Here he is in the tent of meeting. And the people, when they saw the cloud come down at the entrance to the meeting, the men would prostrate themselves in front of their own tents. Doubtless they were awestruck by the spectacle that was going on before their very eyes. When Yahweh had finished speaking with Moshe, the cloud lifted. Moshe would leave the tent and return to the camp. But his loyal servant Yehoshua remained inside the tent all the time. Why? Is it because it was to prevent the people from attempting to enter the tent into the presence of Yahweh? Remember, nobody can go into the presence of Yahweh without invitation. They were just as likely to do that. If they'd seen the cloud there, Moshe in the tent, we'll go in too. No, it was only by invitation. So Yehoshua had to stay there as Moshe's defense. Now we come to a point where Moshe himself needs reassurance. All that had occurred from the time of the end of the 40 days had taken its toll. He was doubtless worn down by the actions of the people and the way in which Yahweh had reacted, having laid his future on the line for the people. He had in fact personally estranged himself from Yahweh. The relationship he had previously enjoyed with Yahweh was under strain. Moshe himself needed direct reassurance from Yahweh that he still found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. In chapter 33, verse 12, Moshe himself says to Yahweh, "Look, you say to me, make these people move on. But you haven't let me know whom you are going to send with me. Nevertheless, you have said, I know you by name." Yahweh knows Moshe by name. "And also you have found favor in my sight." Moshe himself has found favor in God's sight. Therefore, these are the words of expressing real doubt about his future. Remember, he's 80 years old, and doubtless he's feeling the pressure of leadership and beginning to wonder if really Yahweh is giving him any support that he so desperately needed. Moshe continues by asking Yahweh, if you will not lead the people through the desert to their destination, then who will? Is Moshe supposed to do it on his own? Because remember, the cloud had led them all the way through the wilderness to Mount Horev, from Egypt to Mount Horev. Are you going to let me lead them to Canaan on my own? That is why I said last Shabbat, it appears likely that the latter part of chapter 18, involving Yitro, took place at this stage of the journey. Yitro, as Moshe's father-in-law, could see that Moshe was burnt out by the weight of the people and their actions. It likely was the time when Yitro was giving Moshe the much-needed fatherly advice about co-leadership. It appears from the way Yitro spoke to Moshe as if Yahweh himself was speaking. And if we go back to verse 23 of chapter 18, if you do this, and God is directing you to do it, and this, remember, is Yitro, a Midian priest who's saying it, You will be able to endure, and all these people will arrive at their destination peacefully. So it certainly fits that Jethro would be saying these things at this time, after all the golden calf incident. But he's speaking in the name of Yahweh. So you see, Yahweh's silent towards Moshe at this stage. And Moshe is concerned. What? Has he lost favor with Yahweh? Let's move on. Moshe pleads with Yahweh. In 33 verse 13, Moshe again speaks to Yahweh, saying, "Now please, if it is really the case that I have found favor in your sight, show me your ways." This is a man who's walked with Yahweh as a friend, hand in hand, so that I will understand that you are continuing to find favor in my sight. Moreover, keep on seeing this nation as your people. Show me your ways is a powerful request from Moshe, who has been through great trauma and because of the people of Israel. All the time from meeting Yahweh at the burning bush, remember up until then he was only known as El Shaddai. From the burning bush onwards, he'd had a personal encounter with Yahweh, all the way through the Egyptian situation, right through until he had the encounter at the top of Mount Horev. Moshe had endured a great deal of sadness, but also moments of great joy. But now he's personally needing assurance from Yahweh that he is still loved and still needed. Finally, in verse 14, Moshe receives the reassuring words from Yahweh. Yahweh says, "Set your mind at rest. My presence will go with you after all." Now the words "after all" appear to imply that the future relationship had truly been in doubt during that period. Still not certain, Moshe responds by saying, "If your presence does not go with us, don't make us go on from here. For how else is it to be known that I have found favor in your sight, and I and your people, other than by you going with us?" So Moshe further reminds Yahweh that his relationship with Israel is completely unique when he says, "This is what distinguishes us, me and your people, from all the other nations of the earth." The relationship that God had with his people and with Moshe was distinct from everything else on the face of the earth. The chapter ends on a positive note, with Moshe pleading with Yahweh to show him his glory. Then in verse 17, Yahweh finally says, "I will do what you have asked me to do, because you have found favor in my sight, and I know your name." Yahweh continues, "I will cause all my goodness to pass before you, and in your presence I will pronounce the name of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh." Now Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh continues to make a profound and far-reaching statement. "Moreover, I shall show favor to whomever I will, and I shall display mercy to whomever I will." Here Yahweh is saying to Moshe that he, Yahweh, is never at any stage impartial towards people. He is always impartial. He will not show favor to any person, including Moshe, ahead of another. All people will be treated throughout history as equals, because God, at the end of the reign of Yeshua, will be the one who will judge all people individually as individuals. So it's not for people to judge each other. It's only for Yahweh. And he is reserving the right for that at the end of the 1,000 years. So having made that stipulation, Yahweh then prepares the way to present himself to Moshe. And in chapter 33, verses 20 through 23, he says, "My face," he continued, "you cannot see, because as a human being you cannot look upon me and live." Here, he said, "This is the place near." Here, he said, "is a place near me. Stand on the rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you inside the crevice of the rock. I will cover you with my hand until I have passed. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face is not to be seen." So we see even Moshe, close as he was to Yahweh, still was human. He was still not to see the face of Yahweh himself. What about the new tablets? Moshe, having returned to a good relationship with Yahweh, we now enter into chapter 34, where in verse 1, Yahweh said to Moshe, "Cut yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first ones, and I will inscribe the tablets with the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke." The following morning, Moshe again ascends Mount Horev. Everyone else, Aaron and the leaders, along with the people, stood at a distance from the mountain. Even the domestic animals were forbidden to approach the base of the mountain. Thanks, Conchita. It's probably pegged down. So in conclusion, this whole experience has been a hard lesson for all concerned. It showed that the good relationship with Yahweh can never be taken for granted or taken lightly, regardless of who we are. Having stepped outside the normal order of the parashahs, this portion has enabled us to see the chronological sequence, and particularly the relationships that were put to the test in this situation of the golden calf. It has enabled us to appreciate how Yahweh dealt with that first generation of Israel, standing there at the foot of Mount Horev as a people group, and also Moshe as an individual. So the lessons learned by the people and Moshe in these portions, these readings, can serve as a constant reminder to us also in the 21st century that we cannot act frivolously towards God or take him lightly, or there will be consequences. Israel had to realize that they were set apart, a set apart people from all the nations around them. In the same way, we who've been called by Yeshua are part of the one new man. And we must also recognize that we have been set apart, joined into the body of Yeshua. Whether we're from the Jewish community or from the Gentile world, we're all being set apart from our former ways of life. We no longer conform to the world around us. There is no room for us to remain with our feet in 2 communities, because Yahweh does not tolerate syncretism. He does not call any of us to be involved in ecumenicalism. So as a postscript, as a footnote, I'd like to bring something else forward. All these events must be said when Moshe received the first tablets were for the purpose of teaching. They were the ketubah of the wedding, of the marriage. However, he broke those tablets, and the second ones had to be prepared by Yahweh. So that second set were never used for teaching. Instead, they were placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, which resided in the holiest place in the midst of the Mishkan and later the first temple. At no stage did anyone, even the Kohen HaGadol, ever set eyes on those second tablets. They were always inside the ark. They became effectively like a time capsule that departed with the Ark of the Covenant just before the destruction of the first temple. Many people have searched in vain to find that ark, and many have claimed to have found it, or some have claimed to have found it. However, nobody has been able to prove it. But when we come back to Scripture, which is our only true anchor, we see right in Revelation itself, chapter 11, verse 19, says, "The temple of God in heaven was opened, and the ark of the covenant was seen in the temple. There were flashes of lightning, voices, and peals of thunder, and an earthquake, and a violent hailstorm." There can only be one Ark of the Covenant. It must be the one that Yochanan saw in Revelation. And it was the one that stood in the holiest place on earth. In the future, it will be a reminder to people who stand before Yeshua in the Olam Haba, the age to come, that first generation of Israel who stood there at the foot of Mount Horev were meant to be God's bride. But they all died in the wilderness. They never entered Eretz Isra'El. They were perhaps the generation of Israel who displayed the most contempt towards Yahweh. Whether they will be resurrected into Yahweh, into Yeshua's reign, is still to be seen. It has not been revealed. However, they remain a constant reminder that contempt towards Yahweh must be avoided at all costs. So if we have been called by the Ruach HaKodesh to have part in the one new man community and hold fast to Yeshua our Master through the Ruach HaKodesh, we cannot hold Yahweh or Yeshua or the Ruach in contempt in any way, shape or form. We must not treat loosely and lightly the kingdom of God, because it will be where we are in the 1,000 years. We are being called to be part of that kingdom. So let us all pull together as the one new man, so that we can all be counted worthy to be part of that kingdom of the future. Shabbat Shalom.